Thank you. It's going to be funny trying to live up to the moniker of inspirational. My daughter usually describes my talks as depressing. So maybe you'll be inspired in a scared way by the end. I'll go for what I can get. So, MacGuffins, hacker kids, and the troublesome 21st century. Do people know what a MacGuffin is? It's not really a teaching thing. It's the thing that motivates a plot in certain types of stories. I'm just going to take the origin story. It might be a Scottish name, taken from a story about two men on a train. One man says, "What's the package you've got there on the baggage rack?" And the other one says, "Oh, that's a MacGuffin." The first one asks, "What's a MacGuffin?" And the other one says, "Well, it's an apparatus for trapping lions in the Scottish Highlands." The first man says, "But there are no lions in the Scottish Highlands." And the other man answers, "Well, then that's no MacGuffin." The MacGuffin is actually nothing in particular. It's nothing that you can describe within the story, but it moves everyone in the story. So this you might recognize as a scene from Pulp Fiction. The MacGuffin in Pulp Fiction was, of course, the briefcase. And I love how they open it up and it shines on your face. Because I think that's going to relate importantly to a MacGuffin that's coming up. Of course, like, you guys have a MacGuffin story that comes up a great deal, and that's, of course, this one. That's a classic MacGuffin story. But there's been a great MacGuffin, there are a great deal of MacGuffins in education. There are a great deal of things that nobody knows exactly what they're doing that are motivating you. So imagine this MacGuffin. Imagine that you're given the job of training a few dozen people for a dozen years or so to operate a machine. And let's call this machine the MacGuffin. It hasn't been invented yet. No one knows what it will do or how it will operate. Operating this machine will not only be how these people, when grown, will provide for themselves and their families, but this MacGuffin smooth running will be required for everything from political engagement in the organization to deal with the problems of the day, like, in our case, responding to issues like climate change. The MacGuffin will also be part of everyone's life over time, and their infrastructure. Without skilled MacGuffin operators, planes will fall out of the sky, trains will derail, hospitals will go dark. This is your educational task. You not only don't know what how the MacGuffin will be operated, you don't even know what it looks like. You will never see this invention. You will die before it is widespread. You won't even know what people need to know to maintain it. At best, the MacGuffin that you will know, you will only ever know in theory. So how do you teach for that? What's the technique? What's the right curriculum for that situation? That is not your MacGuffin in this generation of education. That was, in fact, the last generation's MacGuffin. So what I have here, I got to take this picture recently, I'm very happy with it, is my first Apple and my current Apple. And one of the reasons I love that briefcase MacGuffin is because of this. And the light that shines on us from our laptops. And how much that's a completely new thing in our lives. So I'm not going to stand up here and tell you I know what the next MacGuffin is. But I'll tell you how hard the last one was. So what I think is my really bad news for you is that all of the world, including education, is entering what biology calls the Red Queen hypothesis. And this means, the Red Queen hypothesis, if you remember your Through the Looking Glass, is that you have to run as fast as you can just to stay in the same place. And the hypothesis comes out of biology. It looks at ecologies and systems of evolution and says you actually have to evolve and change and adapt faster and faster and faster just to stay where you are. And we're still as the last speaker said, still kind of dealing with 19th century conceptions and language in order to kind of churn people out for 20th century jobs. We have notions about this that we're trying to kind of break out of in our Red Queen moment. I don't know if you can read this, but it's been circulating on the internet for a little while. Tell us what class you're struggling with and why. The bourgeoisie, because they own the modes of production. We have notions about school that are there to create producers, which we currently call employees. And they're there to create citizens, which we currently call voters. But that's not what kids or even adults use learning for. They read books to amuse themselves after they learn to read and write. They apply what they learn to making friends and getting people to call them smart. So we end up teaching for abstract societal gain, but we end up learning for pleasure and sociality. And you know, it's interesting, we don't really even know what the basics are anymore. We know that reading and writing are definitely in there, but so is good operational digital security and forming good database queries. That's definitely basic at this point for everybody who's going to exist in the world as we're going on and adding our next billion people to the internet. It's very hard to think in when we add different billions of people to the internet, but here we are. And we're going to have to rewrite what we mean by basics in this next MacGuffin. And of course, one of the problems with our conception of basics and our conceptions of literacy is that, and this is just to explain, this is a visualization of what it would look like if you printed out Wikipedia. Sorry, this is a slightly older one. It's more now. Is that we don't know what we should be teaching people so that they have it in their minds, and what we should be teaching in the forms of paths to information. If this is something everybody has instantaneously on their phone all the time, then teaching people facts is not as useful as teaching people how to evaluate information online to see if the facts that they're presented with are correct. And this gets back to the basic problems of what Henry Jenkins calls participatory culture, which is when anyone can kind of get into this stuff and start to produce and make things, some of which are nice and some of which are less nice. 4chan, if you have never heard of it, is a site that I have studied in the course of my work. If you have not heard of 4chan, do me a favor and don't go there. 4chan is based on producing things that you cannot unsee. I do not want to be responsible for your post-traumatic stress disorder if you go to 4chan not expecting what you're going to get there. Oh, excuse me, I'm plosive my mic. Anyway, so this is a culture where kids can come in and participate online. There's nothing to stop them from doing that. This is not only an adult space, this is an explicitly offensive adult space that is largely populated by teenagers. And all the content filtration in the world isn't going to stop participatory culture from mixing child and adult spaces. So we really need to get better at teaching children how to exist in adult spaces and how to turn them off and walk away when that's what they need to do. We've been narrowing down the range of where children can go, and that's had the terrible effect of making us think that they're not engaging with adults, when in fact they can problematically engage with adults anytime they want, via their phone, via their computers, via the computer at the library. So they need better skills for that. Actually, I had another note I left to myself here, which is that we're also living through, and I think 4chan is an interesting example of this, and also Wikipedia, we're living through a time when we're inverting the value of cultural capital, the information that we share based on things like our class and our common curriculum and all that, and subcultural capital, the things that we know, that we gain status from knowing that no one else knows. Sarah Thornton, who coined the term subcultural capital, used it to describe people who knew about the bands that you would like later. You know, the people, the hipsters who knew about it before it was cool. But in fact, subcultural capital, you can expand that idea to say specialized knowledge is more highly valued in the 21st century than generalized knowledge. Enough generalized knowledge to have a conversation and be able to exchange ideas, and then after that, we have to specialize really, really hard if we want to be useful to society. Because there's 7 billion of us and there's no factory with 7 billion identical jobs. Right now, we don't want our oncologist to learn everything that anyone wants to know about, that someone else may want to know about progressive politics. We want our oncologists to be really fascinated with oncology. We don't want them to learn everything they need to know about digital security to keep our data safe. We want them to spend that time re-looking at that fMRI result. And as a result, we do need systems where people gain esteem and are employable without necessarily focusing on generalized knowledge, but focusing on highly specialized knowledge. And we don't specialize very soon in people's lives, which may be good, may be bad. But let's talk about hackerspaces. Hackerspaces are, I think, hackerspaces in the hacker movement are responses to the total failure of education in terms of picking up and bringing technology to people. But they're great responses to it. They're really, really fascinating. The first, skip a slide. The first one I was involved with is that little red logo there called NoiseBridge. It was the first one I was a member of, and as you can see on this, one museum, one business, a magazine, and 2 hackerspaces have come together to put up a banner in San Francisco in this case. The 2 hackerspaces, I should point out, those other 3 are fairly traditional ways of organizing humans. The 2 hackerspaces are kind of crazy, ad hoc, self-deterministic spaces where everybody sits around in meetings and kind of yells at each other until they get something done. They are also duocracies, especially NoiseBridge is a duocracy. There's a certain amount of time you spend on Tuesday nights yelling at people about what you want to do, and there's a certain amount you just wait till they leave the room and then do it. This resulted in an incident at one point where a couch was screwed to a ceiling. There was a lot of mailing list traffic after that. This is, I love this one, it's a kind of combination of things. This is C-Base. The first hackerspace gets its start in 1995. People coming together to share information, to mentor each other, to pool equipment. A lot of hackerspaces are about pooling equipment. I've got a lathe, you've got soldering iron, let's bring those things together. And form little consensus meetings where we can yell at each other about how they get used. This particular meeting at C-Base in Berlin is of Wikipedia editors and developers. So it's kind of participation on participation. And one of the great things that's fun about hackerspaces and Wikipedia is, unlike the rest of life, you can see that everybody's making it up as they go along. I'm convinced everyone else is making it up too, but you can tell with them. This is the early days of NoiseBridge. It wasn't the cleanest space, but it was incredibly generative. Several businesses come out of NoiseBridge, several open source projects. A lot of people just kind of teaching, learning, fighting, all sorts of things. Very, very strange and stochastic spaces. This is actually from a conference in 2006 in Berlin. It's called CCC. The Chaos Computer Club was one of the first kind of hacker organizations that formed in the early 80s. A little like the Homebrew Computer Club and a few of these other things where people came together to share knowledge. Again, there was no education around this. They were coming to learn things on their own, to discover things, to exchange things back and forth, because there wasn't any class to take. To this day, with a lot of the things that I do in my research, they're unschooled. They're unable to be gotten in an educational context. And that's actually been really positive in a lot of ways, in that there's a lot of things people just haven't culturally developed the need to ask permission to do. No one asked permission to write Linux. No one asked permission to contribute to Linux. They just thought about it on mailing lists for a while, and now it's an operating system that runs Google. Every one of you uses Linux every day because it runs the utilities of the internet that you use. That was just invented by some dudes who hadn't asked anyone's permission. This is an early drone, an early homemade drone being flown around a hacker conference, which is hilarious because hackers are incredibly sensitive about their privacy and also incredibly good at inventing little doodads to spy on each other. Again, there's a lot of yelling on mailing lists. This is out of a hackerspace in Warsaw. And what I love about this picture is, A, they had the cleanest cable rack I have ever seen in a hackerspace in my life. B, they had the blank from an AK-47 above their sound system, and they had an anonymous mask next to it. And actually, the politicization of the hacker scene has been tremendous in the last few years. And it isn't just Anonymous, although Anonymous is the one people know about. Anonymous being a somewhat hacktivist, but not all hackers, hacktivist collective that got involved with all sorts of good and bad things. And they came out of 4chan. They got their start in 4chan. They were involved in the Arab Spring. They also attacked prominent women on the internet. It's a real mixed bag with them. And the thing is, there isn't any formal membership to Anonymous. If you want to join Anonymous, you just did. What you do next, you do as Anonymous. You might use the Guy Fawkes mask, you might not. One of the hilarious things I've seen in covering protests and political movements around the world since 2011 is that as soon as something starts to go down, as soon as like people are yelling the police show up, there's some guy who pulls out a backpack and just starts laying anonymous masks down on the ground. Be like, $1. And he's there. That guy was there in Tahrir Square. He was there in Istanbul. There's just somebody that's like, okay, we got a face for protesters. Come on, let's yeah. And that's how that's worked. It's just become this brand, these emergent political structures. So this is the one I'm currently involved with. This is a Sin2Cat in Luxembourg. I'm a current member of Sin2Cat. Sin2Cat is very, very sweet. It doesn't have as many fights or homeless people as Noisebridge did. But they've got a lot of support in the local community. These are community centers. These are ad hoc community centers that are being set up all over the place. They're running a workshop to teach kids programming in this picture. I've been to some of the planning meetings for these. They bring in kids from the community, they teach them programming. There's a big emphasis on getting girls in the room, how to get girls in the room, how to support them better. This emphasis doesn't come from any top-down thing. Part of the reason the emphasis is there is because me and a couple other women are there going, hey guys, about the women thing. And that's how it comes out of the community itself. It comes from those who choose to participate. This one is, I haven't been to this, but I found the webpage, Tangle Ball in Auckland, hacker makerspace. I notice it is a non-hierarchical, self-organizing collective, like Anonymous and many of the others. We value equality, autonomy, self-determination. See the link below for more information. I'll give you more information right now. There's a lot of fights on the mailing list. So it was interesting. I asked my daughter what she had learned from her engagement with hackerspaces since she was 4 years old. And one of the things she said to me, she's 11, one of the things she said to me is, how social ladders collapse. And social ladders is my daughter's term for how social organizations and people trying to get projects done organize themselves, like how they cooperate. And one of her great lessons from watching Noisebridge and other hackerspaces is that groups of people collapse horribly. and I said, and she's like, and how to leave when they do, right? I gotta get out of that space when that's happening. And when I say, and I have said a number of times, that schools should have hacker spaces, they should have autonomous zones, they should have these things, and they should have some adult supervision. I realized that I'm not just saying they should learn how to solder and take things apart and put them together in different ways. They should do all that. But they should also be allowed to organize themselves into a state of total failure at some point or another. Because God knows we do that as adults. And learning how to navigate these autonomous groupings is going to be a really, really interesting problem for people who are no longer necessarily doing projects that are always going to be managed from the top down. We're seeing a lot less reliable top-down monolithic institutes in the 21st century, and it makes me suspect that one thing about our MacGuffin is going to be lateral organizational skills. And that does also mean failing at lateral organization occasionally. Figure out how you get back up after somebody has nailed a sofa to the roof. And letting children learn about how you work with people when there isn't an authority figure to protect you from getting in fights with them. you know, maybe not fistfights. That's mostly not happened at hackerspaces. There's been a few exceptions. So temporary autonomous zones, this is kind of related to hackerspaces. They feel a lot like temporary autonomous zones, especially if you've been at them for a little while. You're like, this will last 6 months. That's how I felt about Noisebridge at various points 6 years ago. So, and the trick is, it does only last 6 months, and then it reboots itself continuously. And that tends to be how these things run. But there's also a growing movement of actual temporary autonomous zones, the classic of which is the Burning Man Festival in Nevada, in America. Burning Man is a festival where around 60,000 people go out to the desert for a week and build a city. And I think that this is really, really fascinating. And I really, really love this event when I can go to it. Not necessarily for the people who come out and party out there or the things that generally end up in the media about it, but for the people who go out there and try to think about how do we set up a waste disposal for 50,000, 60,000 people for a week? How do we make sure that we can helicopter people in and out here? I know some people that work on the fire crews. How do we do fire and safety out in the middle of the Black Rock Desert for a week in August? So they're going out there and they're learning about infrastructure. Basically, at some level, Burning Man is a giant infrastructure playground festival. Some of my friends go out there and get Wi-Fi link from Gerlach, the closest town, and use repeaters over the mountains to get Wi-Fi into the camp. Skills which they then went out under a DoD contract later on and rolled out in eastern Afghanistan to help farmers get information and cellular connectivity. So the way these skills translate, sometimes it's not quite what you expect. I think like 2 or 3 years ago, I went out there and I found this in the deep desert. This was a movie theater somebody had set up for a week. There's some really interesting efforts that go into this. And the other thing that I really like about it, people talk about how wasteful this is, but what I kind of like about that is that Burning Man puts people next to their waste. They know exactly how much they're using. They know exactly how much they're hauling around, throwing away, keeping, so on and so forth. You're very intimately connected with how much you consume and how much you dispose when you're doing something like this. In a way where if you live in a city, like if you live in a city where they burn coal, for instance, do you have any idea how much coal you burn a day? Very few people do. You know exactly what you're using when you're doing something like a temporary autonomous zone. And those skills and the perspective they give you are hard to replace. Back to our drones and our conferences and all that, people are enacting people go out into these spaces and they enact the politics of the age. The number of drones I've seen in my work in the last few years has been amazing to me, and I imagine there's even more that I'm not seeing. And there's not a lot of avenues for debate about this other than angry mailing lists, which have their use. But I went and I spent some time with another temporary autonomous zone for a while. I did a lot of reporting from Occupy during that, and I've now traveled around to different protest camps. And again, like Burning Man, people are really in touch, not only with what they're consuming and what they really need in order to live in these situations, but also in the fact that their lives are actually made of relationships. So political life in the 21st century, that part where we're trying to give people skills. You know, skills is kind of in the hackerspace area, people taking apart and dealing with this. Political life, that voting, well, this is getting awfully weird right now. So this is one of the protests from the Arab Spring. This is very early one of the protests that got rid of Ben Ali out of Tunisia. And this was very much an effect of lateral relationships. It wasn't a matter of another leader came up that people liked more than Ben Ali, so they hounded him out of power. In fact, one of the big problems in Tunisia after their revolution was that because it was such a flat revolution, it was a revolution of lateral relationships largely across Facebook, and the fact that media could not be suppressed across Facebook the way Ben Ali had been able to traditionally suppress it. meant that they had a real problem after they threw Ben Ali out. They didn't have any leadership structures. They didn't have anything to replace it. And it's created a huge amount of trouble for Tunisia, to the point where when I was interviewing them at one point, somebody said to me, "Did we even have a revolution?" And I said, well, something happened. Something undeniably did happen. But it's not a structure that looks like anything we've had before, and it's not a structure anyone is learning about as kids. They're not learning how to build lateral structures, and they're not learning how groups of people can accomplish leadership tasks. They're still waiting for some savior to descend, and that's not happening in this age. This seems to be largely a time without leaders. And a time where we're still educating people to look for leaders. We're educating them with either leadership skills or the skills to fulfill the needs of leaders, when that may not be terribly relevant. I heard something the other day at my daughter's school which upset me. This is in America, but I heard an assembly, and they were saying, we need to know where you are and what you're doing at all times in order to keep you safe. And I was like, because we learn our politics from our lives. And if we want to learn that we have rights, we have to have rights. And the fact that we've gone towards limiting or eliminating children's privacy makes me think that they're not going to know necessarily why they should be fighting back against this. Why we should fight back against surveillance or fight for rights of free expression if that's something that your loving adults don't think you should have. I love this. Actually, a friend of mine did this, and I love the assumptions built into this. Should we be under constant government surveillance is an interesting debate we are having in the 21st century. We're having it after the fact, which is maybe not the order that's supposed to go in a democratic society. But we're also not giving our children the rights that many of us would demand for ourselves. And maybe they do need to be abridged as children, but to not have them is to also not teach their political importance. So I spent a lot of time, again, in these autonomous zones. This particular picture is from the Euromaidan camp in Kiev. One of the things I really love about the Euromaidan, two things I love about the Euromaidan camp in Kiev. It's, as far as I know, still there. This is there from June. These guys built their protest camp out of tents and spent the Ukrainian winter in them. Again, this is their media tent. They're flying their own surveillance drone out of the camp. People create amazing things in these camps, and even though they're temporary zones. There was a geodesic dome at Euromaidan that contained the camp's museum. This particular display at the museum was pretty much everything that had been shot at them in the course of the months that they had been there. If you want to watch, if you want to really challenge your lateral organization and your autonomous zones and your hacker spaces, and if you really, really, really want to teach kids how to organize well and durably and negotiate, have a kitchen. The fights that happen over kitchens are like nothing else. In every protest camp, every Occupy, every hackerspace I've ever seen, kitchens are amazingly contentious. If you just, I mean, think of your own homes. Who does the dishes? Like, whatever the answer to that is, there's a lot of fighting before that. If you can get a classroom of kids to work out who's going to do the dishes and stick with it, you have accomplished a great thing that they will carry for the rest of their lives into both their relationships and their political life. Bravo. So these are community centers. Even, this was back to Noisebridge, but even in the protest camps, they're community centers. They have teach-ins, they have talks, they invite people to come speak. I've seen some amazing talks at some amazing classes. In every one of these situations that I've been in, this is the libraries are sacred. This is the library at Noisebridge, before its recent refab. Everything in there is donated, everything is taken care of. People sign books out as they wish, return them when they wish. It works fairly well. It doesn't work perfectly, but it doesn't need to. We aren't doing accounting here. We're just creating a community. This is the library from Occupy Boston. I have never seen a space quite so sacred held as this. Or, yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and say that. This is Boston in the middle of winter. It's in the best tent they have, and it's a full library. They called it the Audre Lorde Howard Zinn Library, and anyone could go in there and pull out books. And again, they just ask that you write down your name and hopefully bring them back later. Some of these autonomous zones are more and less autonomous. One of the things this is back to Euromaidan, and again, they've got their tech tent, they've got places where they're making, they've got places where they're cooking. They occupied the center of space in Kiev, and they didn't move. And I took this picture in June. If you notice above the tent, there's the Christmas decorations. The city couldn't get in to remove them. They just became part of the camp. One of the things that came after Occupy was evicted out of America, and even with the hacker spaces that have closed or rebooted and so on and so forth, is that if you talk to the people that were part of these projects, they may or may not say they failed, but every one of them will tell you the same thing. I will never be the same person again. That experience changed me completely. People will talk about self-reliance. They'll talk about skills. They'll talk about negotiation. They'll talk about how they take this into workplaces. They will talk about organizing. People who never thought about these issues are thinking about how you unionize in technology companies, which is, for what it's worth in the Silicon Valley, 2 words you would never put together normally. They're talking about whether unions make sense anymore. They're talking about what we do when the robots take our jobs. We kind of want the robots to take our jobs in many ways. Maybe we just don't need to have jobs. I don't know. Maybe that's part of what we're teaching for the next century. And there's a lot of people in this space that are experimenting and playing with this, and they're doing so outside of traditional hierarchies. This is the project of some friends of mine. It's almost like a hacker space, but they've actually made it. They've actually just said, we want to reinvent schools. They're called the Sprouts, thesprouts.org. And they just kind of put together programs, and they partner with local schools, and they do other things like they create classes for adults and children. They do supplementary education for children. They have wander in and hack at times. You just wander in. There's a bunch of kids learning stuff over there. You go over here and fix your bicycle or whatever you're trying to do. And then they bring in people with knowledge, and they create, again, you see this in protest camps, you see this in hacker spaces, you see this in temporary autonomous zones, the recreation of the mentor-apprentice relationship that we lost in traditional schooling. And that's something that we need in an era of hyper-specialization, because you just are not necessarily going to know how to teach all your kids to do fantastic database queries. But someone around you will. And being able to reach out and kind of grab that lateral skill and bring it in, that's a capacity we need to develop. So what is the next MacGuffin? What are we teaching for the next era? Like, it was bad enough the first time. This is my hope. I hope we're basically going to need to teach them how to live in a totally awesome world with dinosaurs and lasers. My fear is that we're going to need to teach them how to live in a world of megadeaths and hunger. We're definitely entering an era where people are going to take more control of their infrastructure, but also an era where they're going to face a lot more resistance when they do that. I think we're entering an era of tremendous political conflict, pretty much for sure, and an era where building relationships is going to be more important than being able to tick all the academic boxes. And interestingly, like, that kind of was always true, right? Like, the people who went and got, you know, the top of the class education at the best universities, like, when I talk to those people, they don't say, oh, I learned amazing things at classes. They're like, I met rich, powerful people and was able to call them later. And you know, is that what we're teaching for? Are we teaching, okay, if you work really hard in school, you might be able to get somewhere where you can meet someone in the ruling class, and they'll hook you up with a job later. Right now, that's pretty much the best promise we can give kids. But as they become part of stochastic social systems and they're able to invent and create things on their own, my hope is that we can move past that by being able to build significant relationships outside of traditional structures. Ultimately, one of the tasks that is always in front of us, and we can learn this from the last MacGuffin, the whole computer and internet thing, which we're still running to catch up with, is that the most important skill we can pass to children is the ability to learn shit we don't know we should be teaching them. And that means they need spaces where they get to drive the learning. Literally physical spaces as well. Schools with temporary autonomous zones. Places where they can reenact, you know, the Lord of the Flies and stop before the part where they kill each other. Places where they can stand in front of their class and talk about what it was like to almost kill someone. Places where they can go up to those lines, back down, and process that before they're doing it for real. And this century is going to be pretty for real. We've got huge, huge issues facing us around the world. And our political organizing, our conception of political organizing has no relationship with what's actually happening on the streets. And our way of teaching kids isn't going to work when it comes to them having to teach themselves the things that will be invented after we're dead. And that's new. It used to be that change happened over the course of a few generations. Now change is happening inside of generations. So the most important thing we can teach kids is how to go learn things without us. That we need to teach kids to not need schools. And on that completely, we'll go back to my apples. And on that note, I would like to open it up for questions and some discussion, get some discussion going around this. Thank you. If kids aren't in a situation where they're facing any conflict, how do you create that for them? Well, interestingly enough, I think one of the places where kids seek out conflict is video games. They do use that to create the sense of stakes, and I encourage that to some degree. I do think it can be sometimes dehumanizing at times with something like first-person shooters. But in general, I think if you give kids stakes and a task to complete, they'll screw it up in an educational way. Give them something. If you give people a temporary autonomous zone, they will find a way to make it go wrong in such a way that they have a great deal of learning from that. But you do have to give them stakes. You have to give kids something that they can screw up, and there will be consequences when that happens. Not consequences like, and then you're grounded, but consequences like, and the guinea pig died. Life is full of consequences, and we've spent a long time kind of trying to isolate children from consequences. And then they turn 18 or 20 or whatever, and it's like, welcome to consequences world, have fun, we'll be over here retired. I hope that's a helpful idea, which is kind of like, hey, if you don't feed it, the guinea pig dies. That's what happens.
About, Are we really heading for a point at which there is no need for schools? Or do you think that even in the environments that you've described, that schools in some form still have a relevance? God, I hope so, for all of us sitting in this room here. What do you think?
Well, I think that the conception of schools is something that's changed a huge amount in human history. I mean, we can look back at things nobody would have called schools and said, oh yes, that was a school, when you sent everybody to various guilds to learn things. That what schooling is, I mean, we're one of those species that schools, right? Like, there are lots of species who do this, where the adults in some form or another instill behaviors in the young, and that's how they learn to hunt, right? So we're part of a biological tradition that way. There is always schooling. If it makes everyone feel better, we can continue to call it school. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will physically or logistically look like what we have now, but there's always going to be a need for educators. Even if there's not necessarily a need for a house that we call a school, there may be that. It may be a lot of different places. It may be something we move around in more. A lot of the legibility of school and a lot of the legibility of qualifications that we get in school are about making the world more legible to the government. Like, how does the government know a kid's making progress? Well, they have to do something standardized because governments aren't really good with governments are bad at essay questions, right? They want everything kind of in tick marks so they can count it easily. But learning in this mode, learning with this crazy amount of diversity, doesn't look very easily quantifiable. I mean, I was saying, like, the other MacGuffin of school is grades, right? Like, nobody knows what they're for, but they definitely move all the plots along. And the grades that governments really care about are the grades they give schools, because then they know whether or not good things or bad things are happening. So it's a really interesting challenge. How do we make a system like that something that power and authority can understand, but still facilitates a diversity of knowledge and learning for children, including that incredibly important social learning and social organization. I do think there will always be a role in this species for grown members of the species spending a lot of time educating young members of the species. I think you'll all have jobs. We have throughout human history found ways to compensate and support the people who teach the young people. I think it would be great if we expanded and changed what it meant to be an educator and a teacher and a mentor. I'm not sure how much we need physical buildings with distinct classrooms as we have them now, and bells that we ring, which have no, I mean, you definitely use algebra more as an adult than you do bell schedules.
For some kids in New Zealand, I think that they don't do things because they don't want to fail. I don't know whether that happens for some of your children, but I know it is a trend. Is it that trend happening in America too?
I do think there's a huge thing around failure, which is that, and this is very much along, especially in the US, class and race lines, and I don't know how relevant that is for the experience here, but I can speak to mine, which is that rich white boys in America can fail, get up, and do it again, and fail again, and everybody thinks that's great. If you are female, if you are a person of color, and you fail once, your description of your race and or gender, and it's terrible, and we must just never speak your name again. Again, I don't know how relevant that is to this context, but the thing is, like, this is a white privilege in America, which I don't believe should be a privilege. Everyone should have the option to fail a great deal. And I like opening up exercises with people sometimes by saying, okay, step one, you're gonna fail at this next thing that you're gonna do. And we're all going to laugh about it and move on. And we're gonna get that feeling, but at the end of that process, you're still gonna be a human. So I think like teaching kids to fail gracefully is definitely one of the major jobs here. I know that that's a really hard one, and there's a lot of crying involved, especially with, let's be honest, up to 25-year-olds. After that, you learn to cry in the bathroom. But I don't think there's many ways around stepping through that. I do think that there's a lot of power in making sure not only that everybody steps through failure on the way to doing something better, but that they have peer and the supportive peers and authority figures that are willing to kind of step in at that moment and say, it's fine. You're gonna be fine. We set up an exercise where you're gonna fail and you're gonna get back up, and eventually it'll get better and it'll be awesome, and then we'll all have cupcakes. Except you get gluten-free cupcakes. I like setting up failing exercises when I know that I have a stable support structure to put people into. And again, I think a lot of this goes to that kind of lateral socialization. I hate trust exercises, but I like building them in, as it were. Like, I don't like the fall into people's arms thing, but I like the idea that we're gonna just, okay, we're gonna kill the guinea pig and then we'll try again.